A cold wind howled through the trees as James pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders. The small town of Willow Creek was already settling into the quiet of the evening, warm lights glowing behind foggy windows. But James had no interest in the comfort of home, not tonight. His mind was heavy, burdened by a question he couldn't shake. Did faith truly change things? James had grown up in a family that spoke of miracles, of blessings from God that could turn a man's life around. But after years of struggle, heartbreak, and disappointment, he had his doubts. Life didn't seem fair. If God's gifts were real, why had he never seen them? Why did some people seem to live blessed lives while others, like him, barely got by? His fingers curled into fists in his pockets as he walked toward the church at the edge of town. It wasn't Sunday, but the doors were always open. Pastor Reynolds had told him that God's house was a place for everyone, especially those with questions. And tonight, James had more questions than ever. As he stepped inside, the scent of old wood and candle wax filled the air. The pews were empty, save for a single figure sitting near the front. It was an elderly woman, her hands clasped in prayer. Something about her presence calmed James, though he didn't know why. "You look troubled, son," a voice said behind him. James turned to see Pastor Reynolds, a kind smile on his face. He wasn't much older than James himself, but there was wisdom in his eyes. Wisdom that came from experience, not just words. "I don't know what I believe anymore," James admitted. "I want to believe in God's gifts, in His blessings. But what if I'm just fooling myself? What if I've been waiting for something that isn't real?" Pastor Reynolds nodded, as if he had heard these words many times before. "That's a fair question," he said. "Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about believing, even when you don't see the full picture." James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "But that's the thing. I've been praying for years. I've been hoping. Nothing's changed." The pastor studied him for a moment before gesturing to the pews. "Come, sit with me. Let me tell you a story." James hesitated, then followed him to a nearby bench. The old wood creaked under their weight, and the candlelight flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. "There was once a man much like you," the pastor began. "He had doubts. He had struggles. He felt abandoned. But then, something happened that changed his life forever." James leaned forward, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "What happened to him?" Pastor Reynolds smiled, but there was something in his expression, something that sent a shiver down James's spine. "He learned what happens when you truly believe in God's gifts," the pastor said softly. James swallowed, his heart beating just a little faster. He wasn't sure why, but in that moment, he knew that whatever he was about to hear would change everything. And he had no idea if he was ready for it. James shifted in his seat, the flickering candlelight casting shifting shadows on the old wooden walls of the church. He wasn't sure why his pulse had quickened, but something about the way Pastor Reynolds spoke made his skin prickle. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was anticipation, an unsettling feeling that whatever the pastor was about to say would reach deep inside him, whether he was ready or not. Pastor Reynolds folded his hands together and looked toward the cross hanging at the front of the church. "The man I'm telling you about wasn't much different from you, James. He was searching, waiting for proof that God's gifts were real. His name was Daniel." James remained quiet, his eyes fixed on the pastor's face. "Daniel was a hard-working man," Pastor Reynolds continued. "Lived right here in Willow Creek about 30 years ago. He had a small farm on the outskirts of town, inherited from his father. Life wasn't easy for him. Some years, the crops barely grew. Money was always tight. And worst of all, he carried a pain inside him that no one could see." James frowned. "What kind of pain?" Pastor Reynolds let out a slow breath. "The kind that makes a man feel alone, even when he's surrounded by people. See, Daniel's wife had passed away young, and their only child, his little girl, had been sick for as long as he could remember. Doctors couldn't do much for her, and every night he prayed. He begged God for a miracle. But no miracle came. James exhaled, feeling the weight of those words. He had never lost someone like that, but he understood what it felt like to pray and feel like no one was listening. Pastor Reynolds continued, his voice softer now. Daniel started to believe that maybe faith wasn't enough. That maybe God's gifts weren't real, or if they were, they weren't meant for him. He paused for a moment before adding, and that's when the strange things began to happen. James's eyes narrowed slightly. Strange how? The pastor leaned back, his expression unreadable. One night, after another long day of working the fields, Daniel sat outside his house, looking up at the sky. It was a clear night, the stars brighter than usual. As he sat there, he heard something, a voice soft and distant, calling his name. James felt a chill run through him. Whose voice? No one knows, Pastor Reynolds said. Daniel swore it wasn't anyone from town. It wasn't a voice he recognized. But it was gentle, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. It spoke only one thing: believe and you will see. James's fingers tightened on the edge of the pew. And did he see? The pastor's expression grew serious. The next morning, Daniel woke up to something he never expected. His daughter, who had been too weak to get out of bed for months, was sitting up, smiling, laughing. James felt his heart thud harder. She was healed? Pastor Reynolds hesitated, then shook his head. No, not yet. But something had changed. She said she felt different, stronger. And Daniel, well, for the first time in years, he felt hope. James exhaled slowly, trying to make sense of it. It sounded impossible. And yet, he wanted to believe it was true. The town started to notice, the pastor went on. People saw Daniel smiling more, working harder, talking about faith again. And then more things started to happen. James swallowed. What kind of things? The pastor studied him for a moment before answering. His crops, ones that had barely survived the last season, started growing faster. His well, which had run low, suddenly had more water than ever before. It was as if life itself was shifting in his favor. James shook his head slowly. And people just accepted that? No one thought it was strange. Oh, they thought it was strange, the pastor said. Some called it luck. Some said Daniel was imagining things. But there were others who believed, who saw what was happening and knew it wasn't just chance. James tapped his fingers against the pew, his mind racing. And what about his daughter? Did she ever? Before he could finish, the old woman near the front of the church suddenly stirred. She turned slightly, her face catching the candlelight. James hadn't paid her much attention before, but now, as she looked toward them, he felt something shift in the air. Her eyes were kind, but there was something deep in them, something knowing. Pastor Reynolds glanced toward her, then back at James. Daniel's daughter lived, he said quietly. She grew stronger each day. And by the end of that year, there was no trace of the sickness that had once kept her bedridden. James felt a mix of emotions: hope, disbelief, curiosity. He wanted to believe the story, but something in him still hesitated. What happened to Daniel? He asked after a moment. Pastor Reynolds smiled, but there was a sadness in it. He learned the truth about faith, about what happens when you believe in God's gifts. James waited for him to continue, but the pastor didn't say anything else. The old woman suddenly spoke, her voice soft but clear. Belief is a door, child. Once you open it, you never know what you'll find. James turned fully toward her. You knew Daniel, didn't you? She nodded, her eyes never leaving his. And in that moment, James felt something deep in his chest, a flicker of something he couldn't name. He wasn't sure if it was fear, hope, or something else entirely. But whatever it was, it made him want to hear the rest of the story. even if he wasn't sure he was ready for what came next. James stared at the old woman, his pulse quickening. There was something about the way she looked at him, like she knew more than she was letting on. The dim candlelight flickered across her face, highlighting deep lines that spoke of years filled with untold stories. She had lived through something. And somehow, James knew she wasn't just another visitor in the church. Pastor Reynolds remained silent for a moment before finally speaking. "James, this is Eleanor." His voice was calm, but there was a weight to it, as if her name carried something more than just an introduction. Eleanor offered a small smile. "You ask a lot of questions," she said, her voice soft yet steady. "That's a good thing. But be careful. Some answers change more than just what you believe." James felt a strange tightness in his chest. He wasn't sure if it was unease or curiosity. "You knew Daniel," he said again, this time not as a question, but as a statement. Eleanor gave a slow nod. "He was my father." The words hit James harder than he expected. The story wasn't just something distant. It was real, tangible, sitting right in front of him. Pastor Reynolds shifted slightly. "Eleanor has seen more than most people ever will. Her father's faith didn't just change his life, it changed this town. But not everyone believed in the same way." James furrowed his brows. "What do you mean?" Eleanor exhaled, her hands resting in her lap. "Faith is powerful, James. And so is doubt. When my father's life started to change, people whispered. Some were drawn to it. Others feared it." James leaned forward. "Feared it?" She nodded. "Not everyone trusts what they can't explain. At first, people thought it was luck. Then they started calling it a blessing. But when more things happened, things that had no explanation, some people turned away. Others wanted proof. And a few wanted to control it." A chill ran through James. "Control it?" Eleanor's expression darkened just slightly. "A man named Walter Henshaw. He was one of the wealthiest men in town back then. He owned land, businesses. He didn't believe in things he couldn't touch or buy. And he hated the idea that something beyond his control could change people's lives." James could almost picture it, an old town where people whispered about miracles while others tried to silence them. "What did he do?" Pastor Reynolds answered this time. "Walter didn't just doubt Daniel. He feared him. And fear makes people do desperate things." James felt his jaw tighten. "Like what?" Eleanor's hands curled slightly. "He wanted proof. He wanted my father to show him that his faith wasn't just luck or coincidence. He demanded a sign, something undeniable." James exhaled. "And did Daniel give him one?" Eleanor hesitated. "No, because faith isn't about proving something to someone who refuses to believe." She looked down for a moment, as if lost in a memory. "But that didn't stop Walter. If he couldn't get proof, he was determined to take away my father's faith altogether." James frowned. "How?" Eleanor's eyes met his, and for the first time, James saw something else beneath them. Not just wisdom but something deeper. "Pain. He took everything," she whispered. "His land, his home, his crops. Walter used his power to turn the town against my father, convincing people that he was dangerous, that what was happening to him wasn't a gift, but something unnatural." James clenched his fists. "And no one stood up for him?" "Some tried," Pastor Reynolds said quietly. "But fear is a strong thing, James. People don't like what they don't understand. And when enough doubt is planted, even good people start to question what they once believed." James felt a heaviness settle in his chest. "So what happened to Daniel?" Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper now. "He lost everything. But he never lost his faith." She paused, her gaze distant. "Even when he had nowhere left to go, when he stood alone, he never stopped believing in God's gifts. James swallowed hard. And you? What happened to you? Eleanor let out a slow breath. I was just a child. My father kept me safe as best he could. He told me that faith wasn't about what we could see. It was about knowing, deep in our hearts, that we were never alone, even when the world turned against us. James felt a lump rise in his throat. He had come here with doubts, with questions about faith and miracles. But now, the story unfolding before him wasn't just about belief. It was about sacrifice, about standing firm when everything else crumbled. Pastor Reynolds placed a gentle hand on Eleanor's shoulder. The story isn't over yet, James. James met his gaze. What do you mean? Eleanor's lips parted, but before she could speak, the old wooden doors of the church creaked open. A gust of cold air swept inside, sending the candle flames flickering wildly. James turned toward the entrance, his heart pounding. A shadow stood in the doorway, watching, waiting. And just like that, James knew, this story wasn't something that had happened in the past. It was still unfolding. The cold wind rushed through the open doors, carrying a chill that seeped into James's skin. The figure in the doorway stood motionless, silhouetted against the night. James couldn't see their face, but he could feel something in the air, something that made his breath catch in his throat. Eleanor stiffened beside him, her fingers curling slightly. Pastor Reynolds remained still, his expression unreadable. James swallowed hard, his pulse pounding. "Who is that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure took a slow step forward, the wooden floor creaking under their weight. And then, as they moved further into the light, James's stomach tightened. It was a man, tall, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to cut through the dim glow of the candles. He wasn't old, but something about him felt worn, like he carried too many years on his shoulders. Eleanor's voice was quiet but firm. "You shouldn't be here." The man tilted his head slightly, his gaze flicking between her and Pastor Reynolds before settling on James. "You don't know what you're walking into, kid," he said. His voice was rough, edged with something that sounded almost like warning. James tensed. "And you do?" The man took another step forward. "I know the truth. And I know that once you start believing in things you don't understand, it's hard to go back." James's chest tightened. "Who are you?" The man let out a slow breath. "Someone who was once where you are now." His eyes flickered to Eleanor. "And someone who lost more than he ever thought possible." Eleanor's hands clenched. "You made your choice, Matthew." James's eyes widened slightly. "You know him?" The man, Matthew, let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Know me? I was part of this story long before you ever showed up." James looked between him and Eleanor, confusion tightening his thoughts. "What does that mean?" Matthew exhaled, his jaw tightening. "I was one of the people who turned against Daniel." His voice was low, edged with something that sounded almost like regret. "I believed in him once. I saw what he could do. But fear changes people." James felt his stomach sink. "You helped Walter, didn't you?" Matthew's expression darkened. "I thought I was doing the right thing." He let out a slow breath. "But I was wrong." Eleanor's voice was sharp. "Wrong doesn't undo what was done." Matthew's eyes met hers, something unspoken passing between them. "No, it doesn't." James felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "What did you do?" Matthew hesitated, then spoke, his voice lower now. Walter wasn't satisfied with just taking Daniel's land, his home. He wanted to break him completely. "And he swallowed hard, his gaze flickering. "I helped him." Eleanor's fists clenched at her sides. James's heart pounded. "How?" Matthew looked away for a moment, his expression heavy. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with something raw. We tried to take his faith. He let out a bitter breath. Walter thought if we could force Daniel to admit that it was all just luck, just coincidence, then people would stop believing in him. James's blood ran cold. And did he? Matthew's jaw tightened. No. Eleanor's voice was quiet, but strong. He never did. James's hands curled into fists. So what did Walter do? Matthew's eyes darkened. He took things further. James's pulse raced. Further how? Matthew exhaled. He gave Daniel a choice. Either he admitted that everything, his daughter's healing, the crops, the well, was just chance, or he'd lose the one thing he had left. James's breath caught in his throat. His daughter. Eleanor closed her eyes for a brief moment, then nodded. I was just a child, but I remember that night. Her voice wavered slightly. I remember my father standing in front of Walter, refusing to say the words. James felt something twist inside him. What happened? Matthew's face was pale. Daniel didn't break. He refused to deny what he believed. He hesitated, then added in a low voice, "So Walter made good on his threat." A deep silence settled over the church. James's mind raced. He didn't want to ask the next question, but he had to. What did he do? Matthew's voice was barely above a whisper. He took Eleanor. James's heart slammed against his ribs. What? Eleanor's hands trembled slightly, but she held her head high. Walter thought if he took me away, my father would give up. That he'd finally admit that God had nothing to do with what was happening. James swallowed hard. And did he? Eleanor shook her head. No. James could barely breathe. Then, how did you get away? Eleanor's eyes flickered toward Matthew. James's stomach twisted. You? Matthew let out a slow, uneven breath. I didn't think it would go that far. I thought it was just a way to scare him. But when I saw what Walter was willing to do, I knew I had to stop it. James's mind was spinning. So what did you do? Matthew's expression was grim. I took her away before Walter could. Eleanor nodded. He brought me back to my father that night. James exhaled sharply, his heart pounding. So Walter lost. Matthew's expression darkened. No, because Daniel still lost everything. He hesitated, then added, and Walter wasn't done. James's blood turned cold. What do you mean? Matthew's gaze was heavy. Walter wanted revenge, and he wasn't going to stop until he got it. The air in the church felt thick with something unspoken, something dangerous. James's breath came faster, his chest tight. Eleanor's voice was soft but filled with meaning. This is the part of the story that isn't just the past, James. He frowned, confusion twisting inside him. What do you mean? Matthew exhaled. Walter may be gone, but what he started, it never ended. James felt the weight of those words settle over him, and for the first time, he realized he wasn't just hearing this story. He was part of it now. James felt his stomach knot tighter. The weight of Matthew's words pressed down on him, heavier than he could have imagined. He wasn't just learning about the past. He was stepping into something that was still very much alive. He swallowed hard. What do you mean it never ended? Eleanor and Matthew exchanged a glance. It was brief, but James caught it. There was something more, something they weren't saying yet. Pastor Reynolds, who had been quiet all this time, finally spoke. His voice was steady, but there was a tension in it. Walter may be gone, James, but his influence never left. Some things, some beliefs are passed down, not just through faith, but through fear. James felt his pulse quicken. Who? Matthew exhaled, his fingers tapping against the wooden pew. Walter had a son, Nathan. His jaw tightened, and he learned everything from his father. James felt the air in the church grow heavier. He's still alive? Eleanor nodded slowly. And he still believes in what his father started. James's breath came a little faster. You're saying he still wants to destroy what Daniel believed in? Matthew's expression darkened. Not just destroy it. He wants to bury it. Completely. James ran a hand over his face, trying to process everything. He had come here looking for answers, for understanding. But now, it felt like he had walked straight into something much bigger than he was prepared for. Why now? James finally asked. Why is this happening again after all these years? Pastor Reynolds hesitated. Then carefully he said, because someone started asking questions again. James's breath hitched. Me. Eleanor's gaze didn't waver. You didn't just come looking for a story, James. You came looking for the truth. And some people don't want the truth to be told. A sudden chill crawled up James's spine. Are you saying I'm in danger? Matthew let out a slow breath. You've already been watched. James's chest tightened. Watched. His mind raced back to the strange feeling he had when he first arrived in town. The way people stared, the way certain conversations had suddenly stopped when he walked by. Eleanor's voice was soft but firm. Nathan doesn't want you digging. He doesn't want you to ask questions. James's mind spun. So what happens now? Matthew's jaw clenched. Now? Now you have a choice, kid. He leaned forward slightly. You can walk away. Forget all of this. Leave this town and never look back. James swallowed hard. And if I don't? Eleanor's expression didn't change. Then you'll be stepping into something you can't turn back from. James looked between them. The weight of the decision pressed against his chest. Every part of him wanted to run, to leave this town and let the past stay buried. But something deep inside him refused to let go. Because if what they were saying was true, then this wasn't just about Daniel. It wasn't just about the past. It was still happening. And he wasn't sure he could live with himself if he walked away. He took a deep breath. I need to know the truth, Matthew sighed, running a hand through his hair. I figured you'd say that. James felt a knot tighten in his stomach. So what do we do now? Pastor Reynolds exchanged a glance with Eleanor, then with Matthew. Finally, he turned back to James. We prepare, he said quietly. James's pulse pounded in his ears. Prepare for what? Eleanor's eyes darkened. For whatever comes next. The night air was thick with an eerie stillness as James followed Eleanor, Matthew, and Pastor Reynolds through the narrow dirt path behind the church. His heart pounded in his chest, each step carrying him deeper into the unknown. The weight of everything he had learned pressed down on him. Walter's legacy, Nathan's threat, and the terrifying realization that he had already been dragged too far into this to turn back. Matthew carried a lantern, its dim glow casting flickering shadows against the trees. If Nathan's planning something, he won't wait long, he muttered. He knows we're close. James swallowed hard. Close to what? Eleanor glanced back at him. The truth. They came to a clearing where the ruins of an old house stood, its frame barely holding together under the weight of time. James felt a shiver run down his spine. This had been Daniel's home, the place where everything had started. Pastor Reynolds exhaled. It's time. James didn't know what he was expecting, but the moment Matthew knelt near the ground and started pulling away loose wooden planks, his pulse quickened. There's something here, Matthew said, his voice tense. Eleanor crouched beside him, helping him clear away the debris. As the last board was lifted, James saw it, a rusted metal box, buried just beneath the surface. James's breath caught. Is that? Eleanor nodded. It belonged to Daniel. Matthew pried it open with careful hands, revealing a stack of yellowed papers inside. James leaned closer, his eyes scanning the handwritten notes. They weren't just personal writings, these were records. Proof. He wrote everything down, James murmured. Eleanor's fingers brushed over the papers gently. He wanted someone to find the truth. A sudden rustling in the trees made James's blood run cold. Matthew's head snapped up. We're not alone. James turned, his heart racing. A figure stepped out of the shadows. The lantern's glow illuminated sharp features, eyes filled with something dark and unreadable. Nathan. You shouldn't have come here, Nathan said, his voice calm but laced with warning. Matthew slowly rose to his feet, positioning himself between Nathan and the others. You're too late, he said. We have the proof. Nathan's gaze flicked to the box, his jaw tightening. You think words on paper will change anything? James forced himself to stand his ground. The truth changes everything. Nathan took a slow step forward. The truth is whatever people believe. And for years, they believed my father. That won't change because of some old papers. Eleanor's voice was steady. You're afraid. Nathan's eyes narrowed. Afraid. You know that once people see this, they'll question everything, she said. And once doubt starts, it spreads. Nathan's expression darkened, but he didn't respond. James took a deep breath. It's over. For a long moment, Nathan didn't move. Then, to James's shock, a slow smile curled on his lips. You really think this ends with me? Nathan said. His voice was almost amused. James felt a chill run down his spine. What are you talking about? Nathan tilted his head slightly. You think my father was the only one? That I'm the only one? A sick realization settled in James's stomach. Nathan's gaze locked onto his. There are more of us. And we don't forget. The weight of those words sank deep, but before James could respond, Nathan took a step back into the shadows. I'll be seeing you, he said quietly. Then he was gone. The night stretched into silence, leaving only the flickering light of the lantern and the pounding of James's heart. Matthew exhaled slowly. This isn't over. James stared down at the papers in his hands. No, he said. But it's a start. James stood frozen, his mind replaying Nathan's words over and over. There are more of us. And we don't forget. The weight of the statement settled deep in his chest. Even with the proof in his hands, even with the truth exposed, this wasn't the kind of story that ended neatly. Eleanor reached out, gently closing the rusted box. We need to get this somewhere safe. Matthew nodded, his jaw tight. Tonight. They moved quickly, leaving the ruins of Daniel's house behind. The wind rustled through the trees, but James couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched. Maybe it was paranoia, or maybe Nathan had meant what he said. Either way, James knew one thing for sure. He wasn't walking away from this unchanged. Back at the church, Pastor Reynolds laid the papers out on the wooden table, his eyes scanning the old inked words with quiet reverence. Daniel risked everything to tell the truth. And now, so have we. James let out a slow breath. What happens next? Matthew leaned against the wall, arms crossed. We make sure this gets out. People need to know. James hesitated. And if Nathan tries to stop us? Eleanor's gaze was steady. Then we stand our ground. There was a long silence before Pastor Reynolds spoke again. The truth has a way of surviving, even when people try to bury it. He looked at James. You came here looking for answers. Did you find what you were searching for? James exhaled. I think I found more than I was ready for. A small smile crossed the pastor's lips. That's usually how faith works. James thought about that on the long walk back to his motel. The town was quiet, the streets empty, but the air still felt thick with something unspoken. He had come here thinking he was chasing the past, but the past wasn't just a story, it was alive, woven into the present. As he reached his door, he paused. The feeling of being watched was still there, lingering like a shadow just beyond his vision. He turned slowly, scanning the street. Nothing. But James knew better now. He wasn't afraid. But he wasn't naive either. Nathan had made one thing clear. This wasn't over. There were still people who believed in Walter's legacy, people who would rather keep the truth hidden. But now, James believed in something stronger. Daniel's faith. His fight for the truth. And James wasn't going to let it die. The next morning, he packed his things, the rusted box tucked securely in his bag. He wasn't sure where this road would take him next, but one thing was certain, he wasn't walking away. Some stories needed to be told. And this was just the beginning.